Welcome to the House of Truth. Today we're going to talk about the seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and what's so special about it that it is treated as an extra is treated as a high Sabbath, an extra Sabbath most years. So we're going to start off by looking, besides the weekly Sabbath. So we're going to start off by looking. We're going to begin at the beginning of where the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins from. That we start here in Exodus chapter 12, verses 8 through 11. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat it not raw nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire, his head with his legs, and the pertinence thereof. Shall let nothing ever remain till morning, and that which remains of it till the morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it with your loins girded, with your shoes on your feet, and with your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Okay, so this is associated with Passover, and there's a few elements we need to really draw out here. I mean, the three main elements, of course, of Passover are the lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs. And we're going to start with focus on the lamb. The lamb, notice the lamb. He's got head to tail, head and legs. You roast him whole. Is complete, and this lamb, the destruction of it and consuming of it is complete. If you don't, whatever you don't eat, you have to burn in the fire like a whole burnt offering. So the whole thing is going to be burned. Nothing left. So now, unleavened bread, of course, we talked about last week. We talked about last time when we talked about the clean, the unclean. That the unleavened leaven's a picture of sin. The unleavened bread's a picture of removal of there not being any sin. And of course, the whole thing's a picture of Messiah. The bitter herbs, the bitterness of the cross. But that just reminds us of the bitterness of slavery in Egypt, but also the bitterness of the cross that he suffered. And that is the whole point of Passover. So let's continue on with the instructions here in Leviticus 12. And it shall be to you a memorial. It shall be to you a memorial, a day. It shall be a memorial, and you shall keep a feast on the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep a feast by the ordinance forever. 7 days you shall eat the unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread. Even the first day you shall put all the leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eats unleavened bread on the first day, to the 7th day, the soul should be cut off from Israel. And the first day should be holy convocation. The 7th day should be holy convocation to you. No manner of work should be done in him, say that every man must eat, that which every man must eat. That only may be done of you. Okay, so so first I want you to draw out your attention is it's be kept generation to generation. A memorial. Yes, a memorial of, we'll look at the more detail about, concerning being delivered from Egypt, but also a memorial of being delivered from sin, as we shall see. And it's generation, and it's forever. In the Hebrew word ideal might be a little more concept until forever, because there's lots of things that say that use that expression, but you find out they're really till heaven and earth pass away. So. Like the boundaries of Israel, they will not exist in the new earth because there's no sea, so you can't have the boundary defined by a sea, for example. So, anyways, I digress slightly. But here's the important thing I want to draw to your attention to. You gotta have leaven out of your house. In your house, a picture of your life, okay? And notice it's not enough just to get rid of the be no leaven the first day when you have the first holy convocation. You have to keep the leaven out the whole time. And the 7th day, the importance of it is its completion. It's marking completion. The first day marked beginning when your leaven was removed, and again, by the sacrifice of Messiah. Your sin was removed. But like he told the woman caught in adultery, go and sin no more. You're to keep the leaven out of your house, out of your life, the sin out of your life. For how long? until your last breath. The seventh day marks completion. And I just want to draw us a little attention here to this work that must be done. And say the work that which man must eat, that may only be done with you. Notice that. So this gives you a clue. It's okay. This is a Sabbath. We just saw that. It's a Sabbath, a holy convocation. No mere work be done, but you can do what the work necessary for cooking for eating, which would include cooking and washing your dishes. Okay. So don't let anyone condemn you about that. This here makes that plain. Those are considered okay to do. Now we're going to continue on in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 17 through 20. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For the self-same day I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day in your generations by ordinance forever. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 120th day at even. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses. For whosoever eats that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, or be a stranger or born in the land. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your habitations you shall eat unleavened bread. Okay, now remember the self-same day you brought out. The lamb was killed on Passover. The actual passing over happened at night. During the day, remember, a biblical day starts at the even. In the even, so as it says evening or evening, is that transition period between sunset, between total daylight, when sunset happens, the end of it, to total darkness, when nightfall begins. There's about roughly, it varies more time of year, but roughly an hour transition period between that. And because of that, well, there's 7 days, but notice, if you count the 14th day and you count the 21st day, that ends up with 8, because it's the evening that ends the 14th day till the evening that ends the 21st day. To the evening that ends the 21st day, because the evening that ends the 14th day is also the one that begins the 15th day. So those are your 7 days: the 15th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st. And during those days, you're what? There's no leaven found in your house. Again, no sin in your life. And you shall eat nothing. And notice it's in all your habitations. So we're not to have leaven in all of our habitations. We're not to give place to sin. We're not to have some part of our life where well, that's my secret area where I go off and do these things. And we simply make no space, we give no place to the devil. We don't give him any part of our life, any of our time, any of our attention, any of our resources. We keep him out of our life. We keep sin out of his life that comes from him. Okay, now we're going to continue on, and we're going to look at all the instructions concerning the Feast of Unleavened Bread today. And we're going to see how they're going to start drawing some things out to our attention here about why the 7th day is so important. And so we're looking at the next set here in Exodus chapter 13, the next chapter, verses 6 through 10. 7 days shall eat unleavened bread, and the 7th day shall be a feast to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten 7 days. There shall be no leavened bread seen with you. Neither shall it be leavened bread seen with you in all your quarters. You shall show your son in that day, saying, this is done because that which the Lord did unto me when I came forth out of Egypt. That shall be a sign to people upon your hand, for a memorial between your eyes. The Lord's law may be in your mouth. For a strong hand has the Lord brought you out of Egypt. And therefore you shall keep this ordinance in its seasons forever. Okay, so now there's a lot in here that I'm just going to do my best to explain as briefly as possible. But I want you to know 7 days you're to eat unleavened bread. And the 7th day is a feast of the Lord. Again, drawn out. Why? Because completion. You've now completed it. It wasn't enough just to begin with unleavened. You need to continue with unleavened and end with unleavened. And why? Because because we were brought out of Egypt. Now, in their case, they were literally physically brought out of the country, out of the land of Egypt, as from slavery. But in our case, Egypt's a picture of the world system, a system ran by sin and that relies on sin and idolatry, and oppression of people, and this kind of thing. And those pyramids weren't built by the Egyptians; they were built by the people the Egyptians enslaved. So this is a picture of this, and we too have been brought out of our own personal Egypt. With a strong hand, the Lord brought us. With a mighty outstretched arm, Messiah on the cross brought us out of our own Egypt, out of that world system. And we're to remember that in eating this and doing this, keeping this feast of unleavened bread helps us remember that, and we should remember it all the days of our life until the end, year to year. And in his season in this context is the spring, really the first. If you're going astronomical spring, that begins March 20th or 21st, depending on the year. It's really that first month from there. That first month or so from there is when it's going to occur. I mean, so the early part of spring is the season, and we're to keep it every year to remind ourselves. Now, I want to notice this here about the sign being upon your hand and the memorial between your eyes. Those were not. They put phylacteries between their eyes, a little box, and telepheme, and you put telepheme on your finger and you wrap it around your arm, to remember this. But that's not the point. It's not. Those are not what's supposed to. This was supposed to be like that. And what is like that? Keeping the feast of unleavened bread. And why? For the same purpose, to remember. Okay. Now, Yeshua didn't actually rebuke the Pharisees for the phylacteries. He rebuked them for making them large, because they were. It's a frontlet between your eyes, and they made them really big to stand out. And put this band, this big box. Just kind of show how holy they were, basically, to everyone. But so one of the things that the Feast of Unleavened Bread does for us by keeping it is helps us keep God's law in our mouth. All the instructions for this are in the Torah, the law, and it's being in our mouth, and we're to keep God's word in our mouth. That's part, and we're supposed to do it. And we're supposed to do it all the days of our life until our last breath. Completion, total completion, as signified by the seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Continue to look on these instructions about this, because this is something a little connection. It seems that a little surprising if you've never put it together before. We continue on chapter Exodus 13. We're going to verses 12 through 15 now. Thou shalt set apart unto the Lord all open the matrix, every person that comes of the beast which you shall have. The male shall be the Lord's. And the firstling of an ass you shall redeem of a lamb, and you shall not, and if you will not redeem it, then you shall break his neck. And the firstborn of a man among his children shall you redeem. This shall be when the son asks you in your time, saying, What is this? That you shall say unto him, By strength of the hand of the Lord brought us out of Egypt from the house of bondage. And it came to pass, when the Pharaoh would hardly let us go, that the Lord slew all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of the man, the firstborn of beast. Therefore I sanctify the Lord, and all that opens the matrix, being males. But all the firstborn of my children I redeem. So redemption, particularly the firstborn, is tied to the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which of course tied to Passover. And so we now we can see some more about what the seventh day is about. It's about complete redemption. Okay, we're not just redeemed part of the way; we're redeemed completely. It was finished on the cross. It was complete redemption. And we're going to look a little bit more here as well. And I want you to notice this other thing here, that this thing about this ass. What's this about a donkey? I mean, there's other unclean animals and other place where it talks about redemption. The their sons are redeemed. Actually, their children are redeemed with money. The unclean animals are redeemed with money, camels and horses and whatever, except donkeys. Why does think about a donkey? Because a donkey is a picture of a servant, and Israel was to be servants to God. We're to be servants of God. We say we serve God, that kind of thing, right? But we have to be redeemed, and with a lamb, Messiah, the Lamb of God. And if we will not be redeemed with it by that sacrifice of the lamb, then the end result is death. There is no other option. Either you're redeemed from your sin by Messiah, or it's eternal destruction. And the firstborn belong to the Lord, but we redeem them. Okay, so and we'll see why that's so important a little later. Now we continue on in Exodus 23, verses 12 through 15. We're going to look at the next passage. That's chapter 23, verses 12 through 15. 6 days shall do your work. On the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your ass may rest, the son of your handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. In all things I put you I've said you be circumspect, and make no mention of the name of other gods, neither let it be heard out of your mouth. 3 times shall keep a feast to me in the year. Shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days I command you. The time point, a month of Abib, when you came out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. Okay, so now I want you to notice this feast of unleavened bread is a picture of the regular week, and on the seventh day, of the regular week, you rest. And our rest doesn't come till it's completed. The 7th day marks completion of the week. The 7th day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread marks the completion of our separation from sin. It's not enough just to have the leaven taken away the first day. You have to keep it out until the end. He that endures to the end will be saved. And we're to keep this Feast of Unleavened Bread to remind us of this. And also notice it's also to keep what? To keep us away from the other gods. Now I want to say this. It's not saying, because the Bible itself has various instances, and we'll see one later, where the prophets make mention of the name of other gods in rebuking Israel. And a lot of words we have come from the names of other gods. Even some of the people in the Bible, their names were actually from other gods, like Mordecai. Mordecai in the book of Esther, his name was actually a reference to the chief god of Babylon. Esther was a version of Ashtoreth, reference. And over in the New Testament, Apollos is named after one of the Greek gods, and there's many other examples of this. So it's not talking about, and also a lot of common words in English have their come back from idolatry, and sometimes even actually come from the ancient name of a god, of one of these gods. So guys, it's not the point here. It's not to be so afraid that you can't speak. You can't speak, because and sometimes these words like Baal means husband. So it goes back and forth, right? It can be translated as husband, and that's appropriate in some cases. Other places, stuff with this God. It's talking about mentioning their names in worship. Okay, you can say words like music and hall, like a hallway, that kind of hall, and many other common English words come from or either the name of a god or come from sort of association with worship in the name of a god. Music came from the muses, and so on and so forth. So do not get all wrapped up in that. What some of what it's talking about is in a reverent, worshipful way. Okay, not to speak of them the same way you're talking about the name of our great God, His great name. That's what it's actually referring to here. And to help you not do that, you're going to keep a feasting 3 times a year. If you're in the land and everything's built, you're going to go in there and meet with him. And among those is the Feast of Tabernacle and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, to help you keep your mind, your mouth off these other gods. And we'll see what their draw and appeal is as we go along. Why you need this help. All right, we continue on in Exodus 23, verses 16 through 19. And the feast of the harvest, the first fruits of your labor, which you have sown in the field, and the feast of Ingathering, which is the end of the year, when you have gathered your labors out of the field, 3 times in the year, all your males shall appear before the Lord. And you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, neither shall the fat of my sacrifice remain to the morning. The first of the first fruits of your land shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not see a kid in his mother's milk. Okay, now we've got these other 2 feasts. So the first fruits, is for barley. This first fruit is the harvest, about the wheat harvest. And the ingathering ends with grapes. The grapes, they're the last of the fruit to become ripe, the majority of the fruit at least. The summer fruit to become ripe, and so on and so forth. So, and that's the Feast of Tabernacles, of course. And these men are, and you're to appear, but notice this: the sacrifice is not to be with leavened bread. Leaven, of course, represents sin. The blood of our sacrifice, Messiah, was without sin. And notice again, the fat the fat of the sacrifice is not to remain till morning. It's going to be totally consumed, just like the Passover lamb. A complete sacrifice to wipe away our sin completely. But we have to do our part. Notice the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of your God. And now these fruits are not the first ones we looked at about being redeeming the first fruits, the first of every animal, the first male of every animal. Now we're talking about the plant material, the plant things people eat. So your whole life is covered here. I mean, your whole diet, all right, the whole range of human diet's covered here. And it all belongs to him. And we're to give him our best of everything. Is the ideal, is the thing here that should stand out to us. Now, this part about not seeing a kid in his mother's milk. People have taken this to the, I mean, let's look at that. Let's look at what it actually says. A kid, a baby goat, in what? His own mother's milk. It doesn't say you cannot cook a goat, a young goat, in goat milk. It's there, and our rabbis teach where you can't have meat and mix, meat and dairy. You know, you have to have what milkware and fleshware. You can't have them on the same plate. You know, and you got things that are parva. They're considered neither. They're neither considered milk or flesh. And you can eat those with either one, but you can't mix them. And you can't like have a chicken pizza with cheese on it, because I guess you're not supposed to cook a chicken in its mother's milk. No, this is not what it's saying. It's saying very specifically. The first time I read this, to be honest, I about retched and had a dry heaves there, because it's just sick. Okay, to kill an animal and cook it in its own mother's milk. All right. I mean, that's just sick and wrong. That's just sick and twisted, okay? It's just wrong. And it's a practice the idolaters did. Remember, this is all about you not mentioning the name of their gods, not doing what they do in the worship of their gods. They also would use leavened bread, like those big loaves you see on the picture of the Last Supper. Nope. Yeshua was having matzah bread. But nonetheless, they would have these big loaves and whatever, and when they sacrifice their gods and dip it in blood and eat the blood and all kind of disgusting stuff like that. Well, so this is again about staying away from idolatry in the feast and keeping the feast. I mean, keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread all 7 days, all the way through completion. And 7 again means you completed it. You're at the end. Helps you stay away from these practices that come from idolatry. Now we're going to go to the next section, the next couple of the next passage about the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and look at it and see what more we can see. And we're going to see some of these same themes start being repeated. Exodus 34, verses 14 through 18. We shall worship no other God. For the Lord, whose name is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, they go whoring after their gods, who sacrifice their gods, and call you and eat of a sacrifice. You shall take of their daughters, and your sons, your daughters go whoring after their gods, and their daughters go after whoring, and make your sons go whoring after their gods. You shall make no molten gods. The feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, as I command you in the time of Abib, the month of Abib. For the month of Abib, you came out of Egypt. So I want you to notice, first of all, the contrast. Worshiping other gods versus keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread helps keep you from worshiping other gods. And what's the big appeal to worshiping these other gods? It is appealing to one of man's two great appetites, that one for sex. Their daughters do not have the moral standard, and do not dress with the modesty and stuff that the daughters of the princes of the king do. They dress like harlots, okay? They are, and their whole point is to get them over. And the fact is, most men, when it comes to their wives, are weak. They want peace with their wives because they don't want it, because they don't want their wives. Their interest in sex overrules all their thinking sometimes, and they want their wives not fighting with them over it, and so on. And their wives start doing this, and they'll do this. And why? Because the women control, and by and large, in a house, the culture of the house. They set the tone. And if you marry, so one of the appeals of idolatry is these women to get married to them, who then will do what? They'll draw you into idolatry with them. And of course you're not to make these idols. And what helps you avoid that is keeping the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's meant to help you avoid that. To remind you year after year, don't fall for that. Don't do it. Now we're going to continue on in Exodus chapter 34, verses 19 through 23. All that opens the matrix is mine. Every firstling among the cattle or ox or sheep is male. But the firstling of an ass you shall redeem with a lamb. If you redeem him not, you shall break his neck. All the firstborns of your sons you shall redeem. None shall appear before me empty. 6 days you shall work, but the 7th day you shall rest. In the earing time of the harvest you shall rest. And you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, and the feast of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingrat at the end of the year. 3 times in the year your men shall appear before the Lord, the God of Israel. Okay, notice. So we keep away from idols and these things that come with it. Fornication or marrying someone that's an unbeliever. Because you might say, well, these people aren't unbelievers around me. Well, maybe they're an atheist, maybe they're whatever, but they're not a follower of the Lord. They're not a follower of Messiah. We're not to marry them, because they will try to draw us away from what he's doing. We're to marry someone else who's also following him, and we'll go and they will help us draw closer to him as time goes by. And the truth is, women can dress provocatively, or as we'd say when I grew up, slutty or whatever. But the truth is that you're conservatively dressed wife. Your modestly dressed wife she's not gonna she's gonna look just appealing once you're alone with her and she takes those clothes off. But she is hiding that, she is keeping that just for you, not for the whole world. And she's actually, it actually makes her more appealing. It's for your eyes only. And the fact is, those idol worshiping women don't have anything that non-idol worshiping women don't have. But they're trying to appeal to your eyes to get you to follow after these other gods. And part of the solution for doing that is keeping God 3 times a year, keeping them on your mind, because you were redeemed. You're redeemed from that whole system of Egypt, the whole system of idol worship, which included these things we've been talking about. And the feast of unleavened bread helps you remember that, and helps you remember it's for life. You're not just to turn from sin for a moment, go down to the altar, say I'm sorry, and then go back into sin. It's till the end of life. We're going to continue on now here in Leviticus 23, verses 5 through 8. And the 14th day of the first month of the even is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the first day you shall have a holy convocation, do no servile work, and you shall offer an offering made by fire unto the Lord 7 days. In the 7th day is a holy convocation, you shall do no servile work. So these are kind of the summary instructions. We've been looking at some of the details for the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Again, it's tied to Passover. Basically when you're supposed to kill the lamb in the evening, the time Passover's ending, the lamb's dying, and you're now you're being delivered. The lamb brings you deliverance from sin, from being cleanses you right away, but you're to keep being clean. You're not to go back into sin. You're to go and sin no more. And the 7th day marks, of course, completion. You don't enter into that rest we talked about earlier, like on the weekly rest. You don't enter to the end. You don't enter into the rest from sin till the end, because this world is full of temptations. Your final victory of sin over sin ends with your final breath. Now we're going to look at some more instructions about the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the 7th day. Here in Numbers chapter 28, verses 17 through 21. In the 15th day of this month is the feast. 7 days shall unleavened bread be eaten. In the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no manner of servile work therein. You shall offer a sacrifice made by fire of a burnt offering unto the Lord, 2 young bullocks, 1 ram, and seven lambs of the first year. They shall be unto you without blemish. And their meat offering shall be flour mingled with oil, 3/10 deal shall you offer for a bullock, 2/10 for a ram. A 7/10 deal shall you offer for a lamb throughout the 7 lambs. Okay, again, notice unleavened bread all 7 days, continuing without sin. And there's some sacrifice associated with this. Now, the first day is a holy convocation. You don't do any work, but you offer a sacrifice. And let's look at the sacrifice here, because all these things speak of something. 7 lambs. Why 7 lambs? Completion. Your deliverance was complete. Your redemption was complete. 2 bullocks, because people tend to come in sets of 2 different groups, male and female, Jew and Gentile. When Israel was divided, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, they're both redeemed. 1 ram. That 1 ram, which is what which is an adult male sheep, right? Lamb. That lamb is the one sacrifice that brings complete redemption to all people. Or which, how you want to divide them between 2 groups, whatever group, it brings them to all people. And of course, that's Messiah. And of course, this flour mingled with the oil represents the Holy Spirit, like we mentioned before. The flour here, now we got unleavened bread, right? There's no yeast in this mix here, okay? So again, unleavened bread, a life without sin, a life that a perfect sacrifice without blemish, speaking of Messiah. And one more aspect about this as we continue on in Numbers chapter 28, verses 20 and verse 22 through 25. One goat for a sin offering to make an atonement for you. Besides these burnt offerings in the morning, which is a continual burnt offering. After this manner, you shall offer daily throughout the 7 days the meat sacrifice made by fire of a sweet savor to the Lord. It shall be offered unto the continual burnt offering and his drink offering. In the 7th day, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work. Okay, a goat for a sin offering. One goat. There's but one offering for sin to make atonement for us, and that's Messiah. And notice, they are burnt offerings, continual. But these are the burnt offerings. I'm sorry, these are on top of the regular offerings. And this is every day of it. And these offerings are complete, nothing left. Just like nothing was left to be left of the Passover lamb. And on the 7th day, you have a holy convocation. And notice, again, you don't do any work on it. It's an extra Sabbath. This year, it happened to fall on the regular weekly Sabbath, but other years it does not. You know, it does not. Sometimes you end up with like a 2-week period. You end up with 4, or a 10-day period. You end up with 4 Sabbaths. So or something like that sometimes. So. It's kind of this picture here. So it's an extra Sabbath, okay? Because it's rest from this world, rest from our struggle against sin that comes when we've endured to the end. We've completed. We've gone the whole route, and we've drawn our last breath. Then we can enter into the place without sin, where there is no problem with sin. Right, now we're going to leave the last set of instructions here in Deuteronomy chapter 16, starting verses 1 through 4. Observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover of the Lord your God. For the month of Abib, the Lord your God brought you forth out of Egypt by night. You shall sacrifice the Passover of the Lord your God of the flock of the herd. The places the Lord shall choose to place his name there. You shall eat no unleavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of affliction. For you came out of the land of Egypt in haste. You should remember the day when you came forth on the land of Egypt all the days of your life. And there shall be no unleavened bread seen in all your coast all days. Neither shall be anything in the flesh that you sacrifice all day evening remain until night. Okay, now we got some new details here added. Which we're going to look at here. I want you to notice it's called the bread of affliction here. And affliction speaks of what? Persecution. All who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. We're leaving this world system. We're leaving it behind. And God isn't just calling us out of something, out of this wicked world system, but he's calling us into something. He didn't just take them out of Egypt, he took them to bring them into the promised land. But in between leaving Egypt and the promised land is the wilderness. And we're in this world, but we're no longer part of it. This world that was once our home has now become our wilderness. And we will suffer persecution. The unleavened bread is a picture. It's not just about us living it. Because we're going to live a life, we're going to keep away from sin, we're going to be persecuted. And there's not to be seen on our coast. We're not to even have the appearance of sin. And again, it's a complete sacrifice that makes this possible for us. Nothing remains till morning. We're to eat it all. It's to be all gone. And if there's any left, we burn it. because what Messiah did for us was complete, and our dedication to him should be complete as well. Let's continue on in looking at in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 5 through 8. You shall not sacrifice the Passover within any of your gates the Lord gives you. But the place the Lord shall choose to place his name in, there you shall sacrifice the Passover at evening, at the going down of the sun, at the season when you came forth out of Egypt. And you shall roast it in the place with the Lord your God shall choose, and you shall turn it in the morning and go to your tents. 6 days shall eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day shall be a solemn assembly to the Lord your God. You shall not do work therein. Okay, here's another new detail. The place which the Lord would choose, talking about Jerusalem at that time. And again, the lambs were actually killed outside. And again, Messiah suffered at the same time, the exact same hour when they killed the lambs by hanging them on a tree. When they killed them, they hung them upside down, cut their throats, removed their skin. And they basically at that point didn't really look like a cute fuzzy sheep anymore, right? There's blood everywhere, and there's there's whatever, and when the lambs died on the tree, Messiah died on the tree. He too was marred, but he was beaten. He was beaten. He was flogged mercilessly, so marred that Isaiah tells us in Yeshayahu, Isaiah, that he didn't even look like a man. Okay, so this in Jerusalem, this is the place, because anyone else, this to help you identify, of course, Messiah. He had to not just die a certain way; he had to die a certain place. Now we don't get hung up on this. Say, well, we're not supposed to be doing this. Well, notice the place God shall choose. It's when the temple's there. Remember, we're to do this year after year. Now, if we were in the land of Israel and they had the temple standing, yes, we should go in there, because also it's tied to being in the land. But if we're not in the land, then of course we're still to remember this. And our work is not done till the 7th day. Our work in fighting against sin in our life and resisting sin is not done till our last breath. Paul wrote to some of the believers, you've not resisted sin to the point of shedding blood. We need to resist sin even to the point of shedding our blood like Messiah did in resisting sin. Now, this is why this redemption is mentioned in Luke chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. When the 8 days were accomplished for the circumcision of the child, his name was called Jesus, which is so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. When the days of purification according to the law of Moses were accomplished, he brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As written in the law of the Lord, every male that opens the womb shall be holy to the Lord. This redemption comes from the only holy, every male is supposed to be holy to the Lord, but there's only been one who's ever kept the law without flaw, the law of Moses, and that is Messiah, Yeshua. He is our Redeemer. That's why, and remember, this redemption is tied to Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That's why it's mentioned here. Okay, it's one of the reasons it's mentioned here, I should say. Now we're gonna look at a question people have had. Some people are keeping these feasts of unleavened bread, the actual physical feast, and some will get all tripped up and say, well, people have to. But they're not. We've got two things we'll examine right here. One is we got people who say everyone has to keep this to be saved. You got to keep the whole law to be saved, which the whole law would mean this here. Or they'd say, well, or maybe they say, well, this law applies to everyone, so on and so forth. And the other one is, so they're keeping these laws, but they're not keeping law, but they're often there's sex involved in some manner. They got a relationship with they're in a sexual relationship with one they're not married to. Not that people who meet on the Sabbath here, just to give you, just to alert you. And they're keeping these feasts, or they. I mean, I went to a Seder someone had, and one of the people got drunk, and the Bible says not to get drunk. So they're not keeping those kind of laws. Those ones we looked at last week, when we talked about the day after the Sabbath, the ones that are listed that will keep you out of the kingdom of heaven, it will end you up in the lake of fire. They're violating those. But they said, well, other people are violating these laws. Well, are these laws and those laws equal? Because we looked at what Yeshua said. He plainly said the least commandments, and those that keep them would be great in the kingdom, and those who didn't would be less in the kingdom. You're both in the kingdom, so the least commandments are not getting you in the kingdom. They're about your position in the kingdom. Remember, his kingdom covers the whole world. He's King of Kings. There's kingdoms all over the world he's king over as well. But there's one kingdom, Jerusalem, where his headquarters is. And all those other kingdoms are going to have to bring tribute to that kingdom. And if you're in that kingdom, by default, because you're in there, you are greater than the people who are outside that kingdom. Even though it's all inside his universal kingdom, it's not inside his kingdom within the kingdom of Israel. So how can we tell? So are these least commandments or greater commandments? Well, let's take a look and see. And we're going to start here in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 15. For what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifice, says the Lord? I am full of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts, and I delight not in the blood of bullocks or of rams of he goats. When you come to appear before me, who has required this at your hand to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is even iniquity, the solemn meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They are trouble to me. I am weary to bear them. And when you spread forth your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Yea, when you make your prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Okay, now notice all these things we talked about are things we've looked at. He commanded these feasts include the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Sabbaths, the new moons. He hates all these things. Why? He commanded them to do them, and they were doing them. What's the problem? Their hands are full of blood. This tells us that these other things they were doing that were made these things an abomination. That made these things an abomination were more important than these things. These are the least commandments that Yeshua was talking about. And hands are full of blood. Well, you read on there, they oppress the poor, and and we looked at last week how they were sacrificing the children to idols, even in the temple. And one place says they made the streets of Jerusalem red with the blood of innocents, like abortion in America today, and whatever country someone else may be in, even in Israel. The abortion is not only legal, it's paid for by the state and sometimes encouraged in Israel. Their hands are full of blood. And when your hands are full of blood, those commandments. Remember, the Gentiles were told to keep away from blood. Breaking those commandments is more important than keeping these, or not breaking those is more important than if you break those. These become an abomination to God. They're obviously not as important as those. Let's continue on and look in Lamentations chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. Now, this is after the fact. In Isaiah, he warns Judah. Now, in Lamentations, what Isaiah warned about came to pass. And this is Jeremiah lamenting over it. Again, chapter 2, verses 6 through 9. And he violently taken away his tabernacle as if it were a garden. He has destroyed the places of the assembly. The Lord has caused the solemn feast to be forgotten in Zion. He has despised in the indignation of his anger the priest and the king. The Lord has cast off his altar. He has abhorred his sanctuary. He has given into the hand of the enemy the walls of our palaces. They have made a noise in the house of the Lord as in the day of the solemn feast. The Lord has appointed to destroy the wall of the daughter of Zion. He has stretched forth the land. He has not withdrawn his hand from destroying. Therefore, he made the rampart and the wall to lament. They languish together. Her gates are sunk in the ground. He has destroyed and broken their bars. Her king and her palace are among the princes, are among the Gentiles. The law is no more. Her prophets shall find no vision from the Lord. And not only God warned him he was going to do this because they were neglecting those weightier matters, he did do it. Notice he took away their ability to keep the Sabbath and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Why? Because they weren't using it for the purpose he gave it to them, which was to keep them two things. One, to help them keep the weightier matters of the law, and two, to make them a unique and separate people from everyone else. Again, we saw the word sign there. It's a sign, just like we saw the Sabbath as a sign, to make them so the Gentiles could come to them, identify them like they will in the future when they grab the talit of those 10 Gentiles will grab the talit of a Jew and say, take us and show us how to keep the law, so they could do this. Okay, but they did not keep the weightier matters, so God just took away their ability to keep the lesser matters. And we can be certain the Sabbath and the Solemn Feast are least commandments because he took them away. And notice he took the law away from them. And then there's a literal sense to that. Not only keep the law away from them, their ability to keep these commandments in the law, but when he drug off the exile, Balaam did not have a Torah scroll. And their prophets getting any vision from the Lord. In the exile, the prophets mostly dealt with Gentile kings, and the princes are among there. Daniel is one of the noble sons, one of the princes. It's told us, and he went over there as God warned about all this in the Torah. They have people want to be prophets, but the Lord's not showing them nothing because there's no reason to show them anything because they won't listen. They won't listen to the words of their prophet. He gives it to the prophets, to the prophet of the people. The people will not profit from the prophets. So the Lord quits giving them the prophets. They took away even the law from them. He took the law because these commandments we're talking about, these lesser commandments, are of no value if you don't keep the greater commandments. So much so that God not only hates what you make him hate your keeping the least commandments. He'll even make it impossible for you to keep them. And again, the Sabbath is among those listed. As we mentioned last week, it's only 9 out of the 10 commandments are listed as keeping. If you violate them and break them, you're not entering the kingdom of heaven. The one that wasn't listed is the Sabbath, because it's one of the least commandments that God will take away if you do not keep the greater commandments. Put you to work 7 days a week, let you be a slave, okay? Let you come upon you what you've sown. Let's continue on to Hosea, chapter 2, verses 9 to 13. Therefore I'll return and take away my corn in the time thereof, my wine in the season thereof, and I'll recover my wool and flax given to cover her nakedness. I'll discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver out of my hand. I will cause all her mirth to cease, her feast days, her new moons and their Sabbaths, and all her solemn feasts. I'll destroy her vines and her fig trees, whereof she has said, these are my rewards that my lover has given me. I'll make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. I'll visit upon her the days of Baalim, and she shall be burned with incense in them. and deck herself with earrings, with her earrings and her jewels. And she went after lovers and forgot me, says the Lord. Okay, so this is a represent idol worship. Now, this is Hosea is in the northern kingdom. Isaiah, Yeshayahu, was in the southern kingdom. But Hosea, if you prefer, is in the northern kingdom. And notice, remember, they were also, some people that were faithful were going to Jerusalem, but some, just whoever, they'd set up another kind of a false tabernacle, but some of them nonetheless were worshiping God there, and perhaps they didn't know any better or whatever. He was letting them, but he shut that down as well. Now notice, why they consider that, because they broke these greater commandments, like not committing idolatry, and of course that came with literal adultery, as we discussed, shedding of blood of innocence, and those things that we see listed for the Gentiles, that they said these four necessary things they listed are all tied to that. And because Israel broke these greater commandments, what happened? These lesser commandments were taken away from them. God himself said he would cause them to cease. And he caused them to cease in the northern kingdom, actually, before he did in the southern kingdom. When they were drug off by the Assyrians, they could no longer keep the Sabbath. They could no longer blow the trumpet over the new moon, and when the new moon appeared and make the extra sacrifices, they could no longer keep the feast days, including the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because they had not strived to live a life without sin, a life that consisted of keeping those greater commandments. So I tell you this, even on the verge of weeping, that many people I've known who strive to keep these commandments are going to find that they did them in vain, that the Lord went away with them. He wished they would just stop doing them altogether, because they don't take care of the weightier matters of the law, which includes taking care of the poor. It's not hoarding your money up and believing God's, when he says, those who give to the poor will never lack. If you believe that, there's no reason for you to hoard for the tribulation or any other disaster. If you really believe God will take care of you and believe his word. But I tell you with weeping, they don't believe it. And they neglect the poor. And by the way, poor means reduced to begging. In America, that's what the Greek word means. We are not, homeless people are as close to poor as we get. And I've seen those guys with taking credit cards on their cell phones, okay? On their smartphones with a little adapter. Okay, we don't know what poor is in this country, really, but I've seen it in other places. But even our poor among us, relatively speaking, in the 77, I've looked for places to help the poor that actually teach them to observe these things, and there's practically none in the whole world that I can find. If you're not going to keep the weightier matters of the law, quit bothering with the least matters, because they will not help you. Your righteousness will be like that of the Pharisees, and you will no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, we're going to look at the significance of this. So they'll say, well, some are like, well, that feast of unleavened bread was done away with and has no significance to us today, and yada yada. But is that true? We're going to look at the renewed covenant, the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, if you prefer, and see if that's the case or not. We're going to start here in Acts chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church. And he killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread. And when he apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to the 4 quaternion soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Peter was therefore kept in prison. But prayer was made without ceasing of the church unto God for him. Okay, the word church is ecclesia, called out ones. It's not really referring to the building, it's referring to the body of believers. And I want you to notice this. First thing you'll notice, remember, the bread of affliction, persecution, the first of the original 12 apostles to die in persecution died during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Peter is persecuted, what? During the Feast of Unleavened Bread. If you're going to remove the sin from your life and keep it removed, you're going to make enemies. Persecution's going to come. It's the bread of affliction. You will be afflicted by someone, somehow, in some shape, form, or manner. All who live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. If you've not suffered any persecution and never suffered any for him, you're not living for him. It's just that simple. And this thing, Easter, well, the Greek word there is really Passover. It's Pesach. I mean, it's almost exactly the same word in Greek as it is in Hebrew. And they got it from the Greeks. And when I used to live over in Greece, they would do the roast of the whole lamb, the whole bit, because they said the apostles taught them to do that. But then they had a thing called a Polakis, where the man, his wife went into menopause. She'd go find a woman for her husband until the menopause was over, basically. Typically one of her friends or something, so someone she could rely on not to take the family money or something, okay? And I'm like, did the apostles teach you to do that too? Of course they didn't, right? But because the whole point of these least commandments to help us not break the greater commandments. That's part of the point. The other part is to separate us as part of that kingdom within the kingdom. But if you're not going to keep the greater ones, then these don't matter. But notice here that word, the reason I got translated Easter here is because Pesach, it's called Passover even in Italy. But west of Italy, France, and in north, Germany, and places that used to be occupied by Celts, the Germanics, and the Norse, in the sense of them, those three, it's called, they called it Easter. The goddess fertility, same as Esther, Ashtoreth, or Estura, depending on the language. Same thing, goddess fertility. So they said, well, we don't call it Passover, we call it Easter here in England, so they translated this England, Easter, but it means Passover. And notice he wants to bring him after that. Well, what happened? The Feast of Unleavened Bread, the seventh day, when it was over, Peter was delivered. Peter was delivered, and Herod was denied killing him. He was denied, bring him forth and before the people, and then they're making a spectacle of him and killing him. And so too with us, our deliverance from this world happens after the feast of the seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is over. After we've gone to the end, taken our last breath, this world can do no more to us. Our persecution is over. Its ability to harm us is over. But we need to stay away from sin till our last breath on this earth is done, and we can sin no more. Okay, let's continue on. So that people are like, well, okay, that was Peter in Jerusalem. The Jews, the believers were all Jewish at that time. The Gentiles hadn't came. Actually, they had come in, but these were in this context were all Jewish and so on and so forth. So, but let's see if this applies. The argument is, well, it doesn't apply to Gentiles. Well, let's take a look and just see. Well, and we're going to look at what Shaul Paul did, who I've mentioned before and will expound upon, is one of the champions of the Torah in the New Testament. But we shall look at that. Let's see what he did here. And abode there 3 months. Again, this is Acts chapter 20, verses 3 through 6. And the Jews waited for him. He was about to sail into Syria. He purposed to return through Macedonia. And they're coming to him into Asia, Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians, Articus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, Tychus and Trophimus. These going before tarried for us at Troas. And we sailed away from Philip after the days of unleavened bread, and came to them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days. Okay, so just think about this for a minute here. In the context here, Paul is in a hurry. You find a little later, he's in a hurry to get to Jerusalem by Pentecost, so he can distribute the collection he's been collecting for the poor persecuted saints in Israel among them at the Feast of Pentecost, because that's one thing you do there, and they're going to show up and so on and so forth. So, he hands to the apostles for distribution. Okay, so he's trying to get there in a hurry, and he learns these Jews are now Jews again, like earlier everyone said the Jews. Remember, Paul's a Jew, Peter's a Jew, Timothy's a Jew, Gaius is a Jew. Just some of these people are Jews. A lot of these people are Jews themselves. Okay, Trophimus is obviously not, and Tychus. So, but some are Jews, and many of the believers are Jews. So some of the unbelieving Jews who are opposed to him, followers of the rabbi. And he learns that he wants to sell to Syria. That's directly. And he can just go down the coast and be in Jerusalem very quickly. But instead, he has to make a side trip to go through Macedonia. They're looking for him to get on a ship going to Syria. They heard he's going there. He fools them. So he outwits them and goes to Macedonia instead. And what's in Macedonia? Philippi. Now, he could have went to Thessaloniki, which is a heavily Jewish population, but he didn't. He went to Philippi. And if you remember at Philippi, there's so few Jews, they came and form a synagogue. They're meeting by the river instead. So he's out there at Philippi with them, with these Gentiles. It's a Roman colony, practically no Jews. And what does he do with these believers in Philippi? They celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because the Feast of Unleavened Bread is important, not just the Jews, but the Gentiles. There's no requirement to be circumcised to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so Paul kept it with them. Now, to keep the Passover, to eat the lamb, you have to be circumcised. We'll cover that in a minute. But the point is, the Gentiles the Gentiles here, a fully, almost in completely Gentile church, also kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the days of unleavened bread. And I talked about this more extensively when I talked about the holidays taught by Paul. You can go reference that previous lesson if you wish to know more about it. Now, in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, 6 through 10, we see him at another congregation. We saw in Israel, we saw a mostly Gentile. Now we're going to look at a very mixed congregation here, where they also keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we know this from the context. Let's just read it. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 6 through 10. Your glorying is not good. Know you not that leaven leavens the whole lump? Purge out therefore the old leaven. You may be a new lump as you are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Let us not keep the feast with old leaven, neither with the feast of, but with neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. I wrote you an epistle not to company with fornicators. Yet not all the fornicators in the world, or with the covetous, or the extortioners, or with the idolaters, for then you must needs go out of the world. Okay, notice a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And he's talking about purge out leaven, for we're unleavened. He's talking about our lives, sin to be purged out of our lives. Now, we're to keep this feast. Notice the feast. Passover, our lamb, our Passover sacrifice for us. He wasn't telling the Gentiles who were not circumcised, the believers, to eat the Passover lamb, because that would have been violating Torah. He's saying Messiah is their lamb. But we can all keep the feast. We can all eat the bread, eat and drink the wine, like we looked at last week with communion. We can all, we don't have to eat the whole thing, but we can all do that. And we can all keep this Feast of Unleavened Bread. But notice this, it's not just enough to go around having matzah in your house instead of Wonder Bread or whatever. If you just do that, but you don't get the leaven out of your life, it's worthless. We're to have, because that unleavened bread, the matzah, should be symbolic of our lives being unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, not the leaven of malice and wickedness, which they were doing in the temple, which they were doing in Israel, and in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, that caused God to take away the Sabbath and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Because if you don't keep the greater commandments, they'll keep you out of the kingdom. Not only is it pointless for you to keep these least commandments, it's actually an abomination to God, and he'll eventually take away your ability to do so. And what's the big warning here? Fornicators. Well, why? We saw this. You get involved in fornication, first of all, it'll draw you away from Messiah, away from God's law that's supposed to be in your mouth, his word, into their lifestyle. But I want you to notice something here. It's not the company of fornicators, but he doesn't mean fornicators in general. The people, the sinners of this world who don't know Messiah, we're to go out into the world and tell them. The Great Commission is going into all the world. We're not to hide from them and be afraid of having to do with them. His warning is about fornicators in our midst, as I talked about earlier. And not only are we, as an individual, to have a life that's an unleavened bread of sincerity and truth, but so are our congregations. Joshua laid out in Matthew chapter 18 a process for removing the leaven from our congregations. For step to get people to either remove the leaven from their lives, and that gets rid of the leaven out of our congregation, or to remove the individual who won't, to get rid of the leaven out of our congregation. Our congregations, not just us the individual, but our congregations are to be unleavened bread of sincerity and word, of sincerity and truth, that lacks the leaven of wickedness and malice and wickedness that was found in ancient Israel, the ancient kingdom of Israel, northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Again, if you do not keep the whole Torah, if you do not keep the greater commandments of the Torah, you cannot keep do not even bother keeping the lesser commandments, because they do not help you at all. You will not enter the kingdom of heaven if you break those. But we are to go reach the lost who are breaking those things. We're told to go into all the world, and the Holy Spirit will protect us. And keeping these things like the Feast of Unleavened Bread will help protect us as well, which we saw. It'll help keep us from those things. Now we're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 4 through 7. We're going to wrap this up by looking at another one of the ways it helps keep us from falling into the sin of the world, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. All right, again, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 through 7. As concerned, therefore, the eating of the things offered as sacrifice to idols, we know that idols is nothing in the world. There's none other but God but one. For though there are called gods, where in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many, but unto us there is but one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. Howbeit, there's not in every man that knowledge. For some of the conscience of an idol, and to this hour eat a thing offered an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Okay, remember, the Gentiles were to avoid fornication, idols, blood, and eating things offered idols, which included things strangled. Now, Paul's pointing out the idol's not really anything at all. It's just a statue or an image somebody made. In itself has no power, okay? And we know better. We know there's only one God. We know there's only one Lord. But not everyone knows that. Remember, part of keeping the leaven is avoiding the very appearance of evil. So we don't want to even get the appearance of evil and their conscience being defiled. Or maybe they don't realize this, and now we confused them, So we don't want to do that. We want to keep away from this. Remember, two great appetites of man. One was sex, we already talked about. The other is food. And Paul's going to address, and Shaul's going to continue to address this here as we go on in the 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 14 through 19. or the Apostle Paul, if you prefer. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak to you as wise men. Judge you what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless is not the communion of the blood of Christ, and the bread which we break is not the communion of the body of Christ. For we being many are one bread and one body. We are partakers of that one bread. Behold, Israel after the flesh, are they which eat the sacrifice partaker of the altar? What then say I? What say I then? An altar, an idol is anything, or that which is offered to sacrifice to idols is anything? Okay, so notice this eating, like the sex thing, is tied to idolatry. To flee from idolatry, and this is communion, that unleavened bread. Remember, it's supposed to be matzah that we break, and you break it, it makes a snap because it's hard and dry. That is what? That cup of blessing, that wine, is the blood of Messiah. That bread is his body that was broken for us. And we are united together as one by that. Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free, rich or poor, this binds us together. He is our sacrifice. And in the same way, Israel after the flesh, which would include Shaul, Paul here, they the sacrifice partakers of the altar. They are also now bound to God in the temple through through this same thing. So what happens if you eat? Paul's saying, well, what about when you eat when you eat something offered to an idol? Does it matter? Well, let's look at his own answer here in 1 Corinthians 10, 20 through 23. I say the things of the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God, that you should not have fellowship with devils. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord, the cup of devils. They cannot be partakers of the Lord's table, the table of devils. Do you provoke God to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? All things are lawful, but not all things are expedient. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Okay, now we see why the Gentiles so much. Those four necessary things, to begin with. Of course, they can cover stealing, which we saw keeps you out of the kingdom as well. But these four necessary things are all tied to this feast of unleavened bread, keeping you from the things of idolatry. And the trouble with eating things offered is they were sacrificed to devils. If eating of the altar in Jerusalem made you a partaker of his altar and tied you to him, eating things sacrificed to devils ties you to them. The idol itself is nothing, but the demon, the Greek word here, the word translated as devils, demon, the same word, all under the part of the kingdom of Hashatan, Satan. You cannot be on Team God and Team Hashatan. You cannot be on both sides. The righteous and abomination, the wicked abomination of righteous. You have to pick a side, okay? Which is what Israel was trying not to do. They had worshiped the God over here in the temple, and they also worshiped the idols over Baal and whatever over there, and Molech and whoever else, right? And Marduk down in Babylon that Mordecai was named after. I mean, but they didn't do that. But in the temple, they had them both, and like, but remember, God said his name is jealousy. He's a jealous God. Thou shalt have no other gods besides me. He will not share us with the devil any more than I would share my wife with even my best friend. My wife is for me alone. And we are not stronger than him. So, and the people ask, say, well, what about something like Diwali or Holi, this thing where they throw colored powder on you? It's associated with if you go around having something fun, you don't know any better, it's fine. But once you learn it has something to do with idolatry, particularly if they're doing it for that purpose, you have nothing to do with it. You're not participating in Holi. That's a feast to an idol. The Diwali. I have friends from India, and they talked about the Diwali. Even the Muslims And the Christians over, not really Christians, Catholics over there all celebrate Diwali. Well, what's Diwali? It's a worship, it's a feast to a Hindu god, an idol. We're not to do these things. And if I went to India and someone gave me food, I'd go eat with them. If I learned it was sacrificed to it was sacrificed to an idol, the plate gets pushed away, I walk out the door. Okay. Not because the idol's anything, it's nothing at all, but because I don't want to confuse the poor idol worshiper. Okay. And I don't want to give the appearance of evil, and I don't want to do something that's unwise. God does not take it casually. He is jealous. And even if I could maybe argue that, well, I can do this, it is not expedient. It's not wise. Just like we talked before when I talked about sexual health. Not everything the law tells you not to do, a man and his wife in the bedroom is necessarily, you're not necessarily breaking the law, but it's not necessarily wise either. Some things can lead to cancers of various sorts. Not everything builds up. And it's the same with this eating. So we're to keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're by having a life of sincerity and truth, not malice and wickedness. It was not a once and done. I went down to the altar, surrendered my life and told God I was sorry for my sins and so on and so forth, and then just continue in them. It's go and sin no more, like Yeshua said to the woman caught in adultery. It's continue in a life. It's continue to strive to live a life without sin. We talk about if you do transgress, that you need to confess to the Lord and ask forgiveness again, and He will forgive you again. 70 times 7. So He told Peter, He'll do it for you. But it's about the moving on and continuing to strive against sin your entire life till it's completed, like pictured by the seventh day. Your fight against sin ends when your breath ends, and not a moment before. We are always be guard against it. We're always to avoid it, even the appearance of it. That is the point of the seventh day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Until next week, shalom.